My name is Ophelia. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked inside offices where quiet people are expected to stay quiet forever. I've been a project coordinator, an analyst, the person who keeps things moving. The role changes, the pattern doesn't. People usually describe me the same way: calm, reliable, low maintenance. The kind of woman who listens more than she speaks, who takes notes instead of taking credit. I've been called steady, which is often a compliment that really means she won't cause problems. When you move through the world like that, others fill in the blanks for you. They assume your silence is passivity. They assume your patience is permission. This story isn't about rage or revenge. It's not about humiliating someone in public or delivering a dramatic monologue that finally shuts the room up. In fact, most of what happened unfolded quietly, without raised voices, without witnesses, and without anyone realizing, until it was already done. I'm telling this story because it changed how I understand power. For a long time, I believed power looked loud, confident, charismatic. I thought it belonged to the people who spoke first in meetings, who dropped names, who always seemed to know what everyone else was doing. I didn't realize that some of those people weren't leaders at all. They were observers, collectors, spies in the most socially acceptable sense of the word. In this story, there is an office snitch, someone who made a hobby out of watching others, reporting selectively, and staying just close enough to authority to feel important. They weren't cruel in obvious ways. They were careful, smiling, helpful, the kind of person no one questions, except the people who quietly become their targets. I was one of those targets. What you'll hear over the next chapters is not how I took them down, but how I let them reveal themselves, how I stopped reacting, started documenting, and designed a situation where they were forced to use the very tactics they relied on. Only this time, under the full light of accountability, no traps that break rules, no lies, just timing, structure, and patience. There were moments I doubted myself, moments where staying silent felt like losing, moments where it would have been easier to confront, to vent, to explain myself. But this story isn't about what's easy. It's about what's effective, and what it costs to grow into someone who no longer needs to be underestimated. You'll hear about invisibility and how it can be both a wound and a shield. You'll hear about watching carefully without becoming bitter, and you'll hear about a kind of justice that doesn't announce itself, but still lands exactly where it needs to. I'm not sharing this to encourage suspicion or to turn workplaces into battlegrounds. I'm sharing it because many of us have felt that quiet pressure of being observed, judged, and reported on, without ever being invited into the conversation. And because sometimes the most powerful response isn't exposure, it's structure. Before we go further, let me ask you something gently and honestly. Have you ever realized, too late, that someone was watching you far more closely than they ever let on? To them, I was dependable background noise. I was the person who always replied to emails, the one who remembered deadlines without reminders, the one who volunteered to handle it when a task fell through the cracks. In meetings, I spoke when spoken to. When I disagreed, I framed it as a question. When I was right, I let someone else say it louder. No one thought of me as weak. That's important. I wasn't pitied or dismissed outright. I was something more convenient than that. I was assumed to be fine, assumed to be neutral, assumed to be there. If offices had ecosystems, I'd be described as stable ground, useful, unremarkable. You don't thank the ground for holding you up. You just walk. I didn't arrive at that role accidentally. Early in my career, I learned that visibility came with risk. The people who shone too brightly attracted attention, sometimes admiration, sometimes resentment. The people who stayed calm and competent were trusted with information, processes, and continuity. I chose that lane deliberately, believing it was safer. And for a while it was. What I didn't realize was that being quiet didn't make me invisible. It made me unquestioning. People spoke freely around me. They forwarded emails assuming I'd file them away. They vented, speculated, and occasionally confessed, never imagining I was listening with intent. I was present in conversations that mattered, but rarely acknowledged as a participant. That was how the office snitch first categorized me. To them, I was harmless, someone whose work ethic could be leaned on, whose discretion could be exploited, and whose silence could be interpreted however they needed. I didn't challenge narratives, I didn't gossip, I didn't correct misrepresentations unless they affected a deadline. So when information began moving, quietly, selectively, it didn't occur to anyone that I noticed. I noticed everything. I noticed who asked questions that didn't belong to them, who lingered near desks under the guise of friendliness, who repeated things slightly out of context, just enough to make them sound concerning when retold. I noticed how certain updates always traveled upward, but never sideways, how trust was being harvested, not earned. Still, I stayed where I was. From the outside, it probably looked like compliance, like acceptance, like someone who didn't care enough to push back. But internally, something else was forming. Not anger, not fear, but clarity. I understood my position perfectly. I wasn't underestimated because I lacked skill. I was underestimated because I didn't advertise it. And that misunderstanding gave me something rare: time. Time to observe without being observed. Time to learn how information actually flowed through the building, not how it was described in org charts. Time to understand that power wasn't sitting in the loudest voice. It was sitting in whoever controlled the story that reached the boss. And for reasons I'll explain later, the person controlling that story had never once considered me a variable. That was who I was to them, not an enemy, not a threat, not even a peer, just someone reliable enough to overlook. At the time, I didn't know what that would eventually allow me to do. I only knew one thing with certainty. If you are going to be underestimated, you should at least be underestimated accurately. They never checked if that was the case with me. The first time it happened, it was small enough that I almost talked myself out of remembering it. It was a meeting, one of those routine check-ins that blend together after a few years. Status updates, timelines, and light jokes meant to signal collaboration. I was there to present a summary I'd prepared, clean and concise, with data pulled from 3 departments. Nothing controversial, nothing emotional. Halfway through my explanation, I noticed someone else shifting in their chair. They interrupted me gently, politely, with a smile that suggested helpfulness, not challenge. "I think what Ophelia is trying to say," they began, turning slightly toward the boss, "is that there might be a delay risk if certain teams don't align." They paraphrased my point poorly. They stripped out the nuance, the safeguards, the context I just explained. What remained sounded like concern, borderline warning, the kind of thing that makes leadership lean back and narrow their eyes. The boss nodded slowly. I opened my mouth to clarify. The interrupter continued, "But honestly, it's probably nothing. I just wanted to flag it in case." There it was, a seed planted, then immediately disowned. A performance of responsibility without accountability. The meeting moved on. My original explanation was never recovered. No one circled back. No one asked me to finish my sentence. Afterward, the person caught up with me near the coffee machine. "Hey, hope you didn't mind," they said lightly. "I just wanted to make sure leadership was aware. You know how they are." I smiled. I said it was fine. And in that moment, it genuinely felt fine. One interruption doesn't define a pattern. One misrepresentation can be a misunderstanding. Offices are busy, conversations overlap. I had work to do. But something in me paused, not emotionally, analytically. I replayed the interaction later, not with hurt, but with curiosity, the timing, the phrasing, the way they spoke to me while positioning themselves as helpful. The concern traveled upward instantly, while my actual data didn't. That was the cut. Small, clean, easy to dismiss. What made it significant wasn't the interruption itself, it was what followed. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing echoes. Questions from leadership that mirrored that same distorted framing, slightly off assumptions about my projects. Requests for extra reassurance that didn't align with reality. Someone was translating my work, and they weren't translating it accurately. At first, I wondered if it was accidental. Maybe they misunderstood me. Maybe they were overzealous. Maybe they thought they were protecting the team. But then I noticed how selective it was. They never interrupted louder colleagues, never rephrased the confident presenters, never helped people who spoke decisively. The interventions were reserved for people like me, measured, precise, unwilling to bulldoze, people who would let it slide. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me alert. I started writing things down, not accusations, just observations, dates, phrases, who was present, how information shifted as it moved rooms. I didn't do it with a plan in mind. I did it the way you keep notes when something doesn't yet have a name. The office snitch, though I wouldn't have used that word then, continued smiling, continued asking questions that seemed innocent, continued positioning themselves as a conduit of awareness. And I continued doing my job. From the outside, nothing changed. Inside, a line had been crossed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but clearly. I had been spoken over, then spoken for, and then quietly displaced from my own narrative. That kind of cut doesn't bleed, it educates. And once you've been educated, you stop assuming everyone is operating in good faith. You start watching more carefully. After the first cut, I told myself what many people tell themselves in professional spaces. Don't overthink it. I had deadlines, deliverables, a reputation for being steady. One strange interaction didn't outweigh years of competent collaboration. I didn't want to become someone who saw intention where there was only clumsiness, so I normalized it. The interruptions continued, but they evolved. Sometimes it wasn't a sentence cut short. Sometimes it was a follow-up email sent for visibility that reframed a conversation I'd had privately with a manager. Sometimes it was a casual comment dropped into a hallway chat, light, almost joking, that hinted I was concerned or unsure about something I was actually confident in. Always subtle, always plausible, and always positioned upward. What made it harder to challenge was that no single moment justified escalation. Each instance, taken alone, could be explained away. I found myself doing that explanation work internally, smoothing things over before friction could even form. They probably didn't mean it that way. It's just their communication style. At least leadership is informed. That last one stuck with me. At least leadership is informed. It sounds responsible, mature, team-oriented. It's also a perfect cover for surveillance masquerading as support. I stayed quiet because I believed silence preserved professionalism. I believed confronting something so soft would make me look sensitive, territorial, or insecure. And I had watched what happened to people who were labeled that way. Their ideas became emotional. Their feedback became difficult. So I adjusted instead. I overclarified in meetings. I followed up conversations with written summaries. I copied more people than necessary, not to protect myself consciously, but to create alignment. I was responding to a pressure I couldn't yet name. The office snitch adapted too. They began asking me questions in front of an audience. Questions that forced me to explain or justify decisions that were already approved. They nodded as I spoke, then repeated a simplified version to someone else later. A version that removed certainty and replaced it with caution. I noticed how others responded. No one defended me, not because they didn't respect me, but because nothing looked wrong. Disrespect, when delivered politely, is hard to call out without sounding unreasonable. And I wasn't interested in becoming a spectacle over something I couldn't yet prove. So I internalized it. I told myself this was the cost of being non-confrontational, that if I wanted to remain composed, I had to accept a certain level of erosion. I convinced myself that the work would speak for itself eventually. But here's the truth I didn't want to face then. Work doesn't speak. People do. And someone else was speaking on my behalf. The more I normalized the behavior, the more comfortable it became for them. The questions got bolder. The helpful updates are more frequent. I began hearing my own thoughts echoed back to me through someone else's mouth, filtered, softened, sometimes distorted. It created a strange dissonance. I was still trusted to execute, but no longer trusted to interpret. My role was becoming narrower without any formal change. I was being positioned as a technician, not a thinker. And I let it happen, not because I agreed, but because pushing back required energy I wasn't ready to spend without certainty. I was waiting for a moment that would justify action, something undeniable. In the meantime, I watched. I watched how information moved faster when it passed through certain people, how being close to leadership created an illusion of authority, how someone who contributed very little could feel powerful simply by relaying fragments of other people's work. I began to understand that what I was experiencing wasn't personal animosity. It was structural. A system that rewarded proximity over accuracy, confidence over care. Normalizing disrespect doesn't happen all at once. It happens in increments small enough to tolerate. Until one day, you realize you're working twice as hard to be heard half as clearly. That was where I found myself, still quiet, still capable, but increasingly aware that my silence was no longer neutral. It was being used. It took me longer than I liked to admit to understand that I had been cast. Not officially, not maliciously, but decisively. In every system, people are given roles, not always the ones written in their job descriptions, but the ones others come to expect from them. The fixer, the talker, the visionary, the problem. And then there are people like me, the reliable constant. I was the one they went to when something broke, not when something needed redefining. The one trusted to execute plans, not to author them. The one whose calm presence made others feel competent by comparison. At some point, without my consent, I had been assigned the role of supporting intelligence. I noticed it in meetings first. When strategic discussions veered into complexity, eyes didn't turn toward me anymore. They turned toward the person who summarized, the person who kept leadership in the loop, the person who had positioned themselves as a translator between thought and authority. I was still in the room, still taking notes, still doing the work afterward. But the expectation had shifted. I was there to validate, not to steer. What made it uncomfortable wasn't ego. I didn't need to be the loudest voice. What unsettled me was the quiet assumption that I wouldn't object, that I would accept interpretations of my work without correction, that I would stay in my lane, even as the lane narrowed. The office snitch thrived in this structure. They didn't need to outperform anyone. They didn't need deep expertise. Their value came from being adjacent to information, to conversations, to power. They were the bridge, or at least they convinced others they were. And I was the raw material. I could feel the role solidifying in subtle ways, being left off early-stage discussions, being looped in once decisions were mostly made, being asked to sense-check conclusions I had no hand in forming. My contributions were welcomed, but only after they'd been filtered. I told myself this was normal, that organizations evolved, that not everyone needed to be involved in everything, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore. Reliable, useful, invisible. That was the shape of the box. I realized something else too. The role wasn't imposed by force. It was maintained by my cooperation, by my willingness to prioritize harmony over authorship, by my belief that correcting the record would be more disruptive than letting it slide. That belief had served me once. It was failing me now. What changed wasn't my behavior yet. It was my internal framing. I stopped seeing the situation as interpersonal friction and started seeing it as positioning. Roles exist to simplify complexity. Once you're placed in one, people resist information that contradicts it. If I suddenly became assertive, it would feel out of character. If I challenged the narrative, it would feel defensive. The system would protect its assumptions. Understanding that was strangely calming. It meant I didn't need to convince anyone of anything yet. I didn't need to reclaim visibility immediately. I needed to understand the mechanics of the role I'd been given and the role the snitch had chosen for themselves. They were the observer, I was the observer. They were the messenger, I was the source. That asymmetry was the problem, and also I began to see the opportunity. Because roles only work when everyone believes in them, and I was very close to no longer believing. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no raised voice, no dramatic realization that snapped into place. It happened on a day so ordinary I almost missed it. I was sitting alone at my desk early in the morning, before the office filled up. The kind of quiet that only exists before email notifications begin dictating the rhythm of the day. I was reviewing a document I'd sent the night before, notes from a cross-team discussion that I'd facilitated but hadn't attended in name. As I read through it, something felt off. Not the content, the framing. I noticed how carefully I'd softened my own conclusions. How many qualifiers did I add? How often I'd written we might consider instead of we should. It wasn't indecision. It was self-editing, performed so automatically that I hadn't questioned it. I realized I was preemptively making space for someone else to rephrase me. That was the moment. I didn't feel angry. I felt precise. I understood that I had been adapting to an environment that no longer required my adaptation. I wasn't avoiding conflict anymore. I was avoiding clarity. And clarity, I realized, was what the system actually resisted. Around mid-morning, the office snitch stopped by my desk. They asked a question about the document. A simple one, innocent on the surface. But the subtext was familiar, probing for uncertainty, for anything that could be packaged as a concern. I answered calmly, directly, without hedging. They nodded, smiled, and then asked, "Do you want me to flag this to leadership just so they're aware?" I paused. In the past, I would have said yes out of reflex. Visibility felt safer than omission. But something in me had shifted from accommodation to intention. "No," I said. "It's already clear in the doc." It was a small refusal, barely noticeable, but the reaction was immediate. They blinked, recovered quickly. "Got it," they said, and moved on. That exchange stayed with me all day. Not because of what was said, but because of what I felt afterward. Relief. Not from avoiding conflict, but from asserting authorship. For the first time in a long while, I hadn't allowed someone else to mediate my voice. Later that afternoon, I observed something else. The snitch still moved through the office as usual, chatting, checking in, collecting impressions, but they didn't stop at my desk again. The flow of questions slowed. It wasn't avoidance, it was recalibration. That's when I understood the truth I'd been circling for months. Silence had never been my weakness. Unchosen silence was. I hadn't lost power because I was quiet. I'd lost power because my quietness had been available for others to use. The moment I reclaimed choice, even subtly, the dynamic changed. That day didn't alter my role externally. No one announced a shift. No org chart was updated. But internally, I made a decision that would guide everything that followed. I would no longer correct misunderstandings emotionally. I would no longer defend myself verbally. I would let systems speak. Instead of asking to be seen differently, I would position information so it couldn't be misseen. I went home that evening and opened my notebook, the leather one I carried everywhere. I didn't write a plan, I wrote a sentence. Silence is only a weakness when it isn't deliberate. That was the day something shifted, not because anyone else changed, but because I did. After that day, I didn't become louder. I became narrower. My words were fewer, but they landed exactly where I intended. I stopped narrating my thought process in real time. I stopped filling space for the comfort of others. When asked a question, I answered only what was asked. Nothing extra, nothing anticipatory. From the outside, it probably looked like I was withdrawing. Inside, I was calibrating. Silence, when chosen, changes texture. It's no longer an absence, it's a boundary. And boundaries make people reveal themselves, not because you confront them, but because you no longer cushion their behavior. The office snitch noticed the change quickly. They began checking in more often, but with less specificity. Just seeing how things are going. Anything I should be aware of? Questions designed to keep the channel open without committing to content. I responded kindly, briefly, with information that was complete but not interpretive. No speculation, no tone, no vulnerability. They mistook this for compliance. I could see it in how relaxed they became. The way they resumed summarizing conversations without looping me in. The way they continued to helpfully contextualize projects to leadership, assuming I wouldn't intervene. My silence to them still meant availability. They didn't realize the difference between availability and access. I started routing information differently, not hiding it, placing it. Key updates went into shared documents with clear ownership lines. Decisions were logged with timestamps. Questions were answered in writing, visible to the right people at the right time. I wasn't building a case, I was building a record. Others noticed small changes too. A manager commented that my updates were very clear lately. A colleague thanked me for summarizing next steps so cleanly. These were quiet affirmations, not praise, just recognition that something had shifted in how information moved. The snitch, however, began to experience friction. Their summaries didn't align as easily anymore. When they attempted to reframe my work, there was already a document contradicting it, calmly, factually, without accusation. Leadership began asking follow-up questions that required specifics, not impressions. I watched all of this without reacting. Silence, when strategic, creates a vacuum. People rush to fill it. And in doing so, they expose patterns they didn't know they had. I learned a lot during this period, not just about the snitch, but about myself. I learned how often I'd used explanation as a form of permission, how clarity, delivered without emotion, disarmed manipulation more effectively than confrontation ever could. There were moments of discomfort, times when staying quiet felt like letting something slide. But I reminded myself, this wasn't about winning exchanges. It was about changing outcomes. The snitch began to overreach. They flagged minor issues. They speculated out loud. They tried to stay relevant by increasing volume. The very behavior that had once blended into the background now stood out against the clean, documented flow of information. I didn't correct them. I didn't contradict them publicly. I simply made sure the truth existed, intact and accessible. That's the paradox of chosen silence. It looks passive to those who rely on noise, and authoritative to those who rely on facts. By the end of that quarter, the dynamic had subtly reversed. I was still quiet, still composed, still doing the work. But now when questions arose, people came to me directly, not because I demanded it, but because the system pointed back to the source. The snitch hadn't lost their smile. They hadn't been confronted. They hadn't been exposed. They had simply been outpaced, and they didn't yet realize why. What they never noticed was that I had stopped reacting and started mapping. While the office snitch focused on staying visible, I focused on staying precise. I paid attention not just to what was said, but where it landed. Which conversations influenced decisions? Which documents were skimmed versus archived? Which updates leadership returned weeks later when something went wrong? Power leaves fingerprints. Most people are too busy performing to notice them. I noticed patterns in calendars, standing meetings that never produced outcomes, one-on-ones that mysteriously aligned with sudden shifts in perception. I noticed which questions came from curiosity and which came from fishing, asked not to understand but to collect. And I noticed how rarely anyone checked the source. That realization sharpened everything. I began preparing without announcing that I was preparing. Not in secret, not defensively, methodically. I refined how I documented work so that context lived alongside conclusions. I learned which stakeholders preferred brevity and which needed detail. I stopped assuming alignment and started designing for it. Most importantly, I learned how to let the record speak before anyone else could interpret it. The snitch continued their routine. They popped into conversations. They asked follow-up questions that sounded collaborative but were actually diagnostic. They shared concerns framed as care. And because no one had challenged them yet, their confidence grew. Confidence makes people sloppy. They didn't notice when I began CCing selectively, when I referenced prior decisions by date and document instead of memory, when I used neutral language that left no room for implication. They didn't notice that leadership began replying directly to me with clarifying questions, bypassing the intermediary entirely. What they also didn't notice was how much information I now held, not secrets, signals. I understood the organization's tolerance for ambiguity. I knew which metrics mattered in performance reviews and which were decorative. I knew how escalation thresholds worked, what constituted a real issue versus background noise. I knew who valued initiative and who valued risk containment. And I knew exactly how the snitch positioned themselves within all of it. They were useful only when things were unclear. Their power depended on interpretation, on being the lens through which uncertainty traveled upward. As clarity increased, their role became redundant. But redundancy doesn't announce itself. It waits. I never confronted them, never hinted that I saw the pattern. That was crucial. People only reveal their true strategies when they believe they're unobserved or underestimated. Instead, I made one quiet change that accelerated everything. I began closing loops publicly. When a question arose, I answered it once, in writing, with everyone relevant included. When a concern surfaced, I addressed it directly with data, not reassurance. I didn't defend my work, I anchored it. This had an unintended effect. The snitches' updates started to sound thin. They repeated things already resolved. They raised issues already documented. Their summaries added no new value. Leadership didn't reprimand them. They simply asked fewer follow-ups. Attention drifted. I could sense the shift before it was visible. That's the advantage of watching without needing credit. I saw the moment when the snitch began to feel it too, the slight urgency in their voice, the increase in just checking in messages, the subtle attempt to reinsert themselves into conversations that no longer needed a translator. They still didn't see me. They saw a system changing. They assumed it was temporary. What they never noticed was that every move they made was now being logged, not as evidence against them, but as part of a pattern that would eventually require explanation. They were building their own record, and I was simply ensuring it remained intact. Preparation doesn't feel powerful while you're doing it. It feels patient, almost dull, but it changes the terrain in ways no confrontation ever could. By the time the snitch realized something was wrong, they would already be standing in a structure they didn't design and couldn't manipulate. I didn't rush. I didn't need to. The work was already doing what it was meant to do. The reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no rush, no sense of triumph. It arrived quietly, like a fact you've known subconsciously but finally allow yourself to articulate. I was reviewing a routine performance dashboard late one afternoon, the kind that rarely tells you anything new if you're not looking for it. Most people glance at the highlights and move on. I didn't. I compared it against my notes, dates, decisions, follow-ups, not to catch anyone out, but to understand alignment. That's when I saw it. A discrepancy, not in numbers, but in narrative. Several risks that had been attributed to my projects over the past months had a common origin, not the data, not the teams involved. The origin was commentary, summaries, check-ins, informal updates, always verbal first, always attributed vaguely, always framed as proactive awareness, and always traceable back to the same person. I followed the trail carefully. I cross-referenced meeting notes with written follow-ups. I matched timelines. I compared how issues were described before and after passing through that intermediary layer. What emerged wasn't sabotage. It was something more insidious and more fragile. They weren't inventing problems. They were repackaging uncertainty and attaching my name to it. That was the leverage, because uncertainty, when repeated often enough, becomes reputation. I sat with that realization longer than I expected, not because I was shocked, but because I wanted to be certain of my response. This wasn't about proving intent. Intent is slippery and rarely necessary. This was about impact and documentation. I understood then that I didn't need to expose anything. I didn't need to accuse. The system already had everything it needed to see the pattern. It just hadn't been invited to look. And here was the most important part of the reveal. The snitch believed they were indispensable. They believed leadership relied on them to sense the temperature. They believed their role was protective, even necessary. That belief made them careless. They hadn't diversified their narrative. They hadn't built corroboration. They had relied on repetition and proximity. And repetition, when tracked, creates consistency. Consistency creates traceability. I realized something else too, something that required restraint. If I confronted them directly, the behavior would stop. They'd become cautious. The pattern would dissolve into plausible deniability. The system would remain unchanged. But if I did nothing, if I simply continued positioning clarity where ambiguity once lived, the behavior would have to escalate to remain effective. And escalation leaves footprints. That was the moment of clarity, not excitement, not anger, just understanding. I closed my laptop and didn't take any action that day, because leverage isn't something you use the moment you find it. It's something you hold while you design the conditions under which it becomes undeniable. I also saw my own responsibility clearly. I had allowed my work to be interpreted instead of anchored. I had assumed professionalism would protect me from distortion. That assumption was over. The reveal wasn't about them. It was about me. I didn't feel superior. I felt resolved. From that point on, every decision I made was guided by a simple principle. Let the system do what it claims to value. Accuracy, accountability, traceability. If someone thrived in ambiguity, I would remove ambiguity, not aggressively, not defensively, but structurally. The snitch still smiled at me in the hallway, still asked light questions, still believed I was unaware. I didn't correct that belief. Some truths are most powerful when they remain private, at least until the moment they no longer can. Once you see the full shape of something, you can't unsee it. The decision wasn't about whether to act. It was about how, and just as importantly, when. I had options, many of them. Some were tempting in their simplicity. I could request a private conversation, lay out the pattern calmly, ask for clarification. It would sound reasonable, professional. It would also alert them instantly. People who survive on interpretation adapt quickly when they know they're being watched. I could escalate to management with documentation, present a timeline, ask for intervention. That would likely end the behavior, but it would also frame me as reactive, as someone responding to interpersonal conflict rather than systemic distortion. Or I could do nothing. Let the system continue as it was. Let the snitch operate. Let my work remain exposed to interpretation. That option was the easiest in the short term, and the most expensive in the long run. There was a fourth option, the one I hadn't fully articulated until that moment. I could redesign the environment in which the behavior existed. Do not confront the person. Do not accuse the intent. But remove the conditions that made the behavior effective. This option was irreversible. Once I began, there would be no clean way back to how things were. No pretending nothing had changed. No reclaiming plausible innocence. I sat with that weight. Irreversible choices require emotional neutrality. If you act from anger, you second-guess later. If you act from fear, you rush. I needed to be certain that what I was about to do aligned with my values, not just my frustration. So I asked myself one question. If this were happening to someone else, what would I respect them for doing? The answer was clear. I would respect them for refusing to participate in distortion, quietly, consistently, without spectacle. For trusting systems enough to let them fail or self-correct under truth. That was the path I chose. The decision point wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel powerful. It felt steady, like stepping onto a bridge you know will hold, even if you can't see the other side yet. From that day forward, I committed to 3 rules. I would never speak about my work without a written anchor. I would never respond to speculation, only to specifics. And I would never correct someone else's narrative verbally if a documented version already existed. These weren't tactics. There were constraints. And constraints, I've learned, shape behavior far more effectively than confrontation ever does. I knew what this choice would trigger. The snitch would feel their influence weakening. They would compensate, increase frequency, expand scope, insert themselves more aggressively. That wasn't a risk. It was part of the design. Because the moment someone is forced to show more of themselves to maintain relevance is the moment they reveal what they're actually doing. I didn't need them to fail. I needed them to be themselves, clearly, consistently, and on record. That was the irreversible choice. Once I made it, I didn't look back. From the outside, nothing appeared to change. There were no announcements, no shifts in tone, no sudden confidence or withdrawal. I still arrived early, left on time, and delivered exactly what was expected of me. If anything, I became less noticeable, quieter in meetings, more concise in messages, less present in informal chatter. Internally, everything was in motion. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about alignment. Every action I took served a purpose, even if that purpose was invisible to everyone else. I wasn't trying to outmaneuver anyone. I was letting structure do the heavy lifting. I started by standardizing my outputs. All project updates followed the same format. Context, decision, owner, timestamp. No opinions, no soft language, no room for reinterpretation. If something was unresolved, it was clearly labeled as such, with next steps assigned. This had an immediate effect. When questions arose, people stopped asking around the work and started asking within it. There was nothing to clarify verbally because everything necessary was already there. The system didn't need a translator. The office snitch adapted by increasing visibility. They scheduled more check-ins, offered to sync, asked if I wanted help framing updates for leadership. I declined politely, consistently, without explanation. No thank you. It's covered in the doc. We can revisit if needed. Short sentences, neutral tone. They didn't push back. They couldn't. There was nothing to argue with. I also began redirecting informal conversations. When someone asked a speculative question in passing, I responded with, "That's documented. Happy to walk you through it there." This wasn't defensiveness, it was precision. Over time, people learned that if they wanted context, they knew exactly where to find it. Leadership noticed the shift before anyone else. Meetings became shorter, decisions clearer, follow-ups rarer. Not because issues disappeared, but because ambiguity did. And ambiguity had been the oxygen for the snitch's role. I never highlighted that change. I didn't need to. The snitch began feeling the absence. Their updates no longer landed with the same weight. Leadership responded with, "That's already addressed," or "We have that in writing." Not dismissively, factually. I could see the recalibration happening in real time. The snitch's body language changed. Their questions became broader, less grounded. They started looping themselves into threads unnecessarily, hoping to reinsert relevance. Still, I said nothing. Silence, when paired with consistency, becomes unassailable. There were moments when I was tempted to explain myself, to articulate what I was doing, to make the shift explicit. But that would have been self-indulgent. The goal wasn't recognition, it was resolution. By the end of that cycle, the organization had quietly adjusted its behavior around clarity. Not because of policy, because of an example. People mirrored what worked. The snitch was still present, still smiling, still engaged, but they were no longer central. And that was the beginning of the consequences. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They arrive as absences. At first, it was subtle enough that only I noticed. The snitch was still invited to meetings, but no longer asked to summarize. Still CC'd, but rarely replied to directly. Still present, but no longer pivotal. They hadn't been demoted, nothing had been said. But the gravitational pull had shifted. Information no longer passed through them, it passed around them. I saw it in leadership behavior. Questions that once came filtered now arrived unmediated. Clarifications were requested directly from sources. Decisions referenced documents, not impressions. The organization hadn't chosen sides. It had chosen efficiency. And efficiency has no loyalty. The snitch responded the only way they knew how, by increasing activity. They sent more messages, flagged more risks, offered more help. Each action was meant to reassert relevance. Each one instead made the contrast sharper. When everything is clearly documented, excessive commentary stands out. Colleagues began hesitating before engaging. Not consciously, not cruelly, just intuitively. People gravitate toward clarity because it reduces effort. The snitch's presence now added friction instead of removing it. I noticed the first visible crack during a team review. A concern was raised, one that the snitch had mentioned in advance. Leadership turned to the document, read silently, looked up. This seems already resolved, the boss said. Am I missing something? The snitch spoke quickly, tried to contextualize. The words piled up without anchoring. The moment passed, unresolved, not in their favor. No one corrected them, no one defended them. The meeting moved on. Afterward, I didn't feel satisfied. I felt inevitability. When someone's influence is built on interpretation, clarity feels like erosion. Not dramatic collapse, slow, undeniable wearing away. The snitch began to sense it too. Their tone shifted, less confident, more cautious. They asked me questions again, more pointed now, less casual. I answered exactly as before, calm, documented, unemotional. I didn't gloat, I didn't distance myself. I treated them the same way I treated everyone else. That was the hardest part. It's tempting when the balance shifts to signal awareness, to let someone know you see them clearly now, but signaling would have reintroduced emotion, and emotion would have blurred the outcome. The consequences weren't personal, they were structural. Leadership didn't stop trusting the snitch, they stopped needing them. And need is what creates leverage. Weeks later, I heard it indirectly. A colleague mentioned that leadership had asked for fewer informal check-ins and more written summaries. No names, no blame, just a preference. Preferences shape behavior faster than reprimands. The snitch adapted again, this time by retreating. Less visible, quieter, watching. I recognized the phase immediately. It's the moment when someone realizes their old strategy no longer works, but hasn't yet found a new one. They weren't angry, they were confused. And confusion, when prolonged, becomes panic. Still, nothing irreversible had happened yet. This was the beginning, not the end. A system recalibrating, a role dissolving without replacement. I stayed exactly where I was, steady, clear, silent, because the most profound consequences don't come from exposure. They come from irrelevance. There is a point in every quiet collapse where effort no longer changes the outcome. I could see the snitch crossing that point long before they did. They tried to repair the situation the only way they knew how, by re-entering spaces they had once dominated. They scheduled catch-ups, sent long messages framed as alignment, asked questions that arrived just a little too late, about issues that had already been resolved in writing. The timing was the problem. When trust erodes slowly, people don't notice the moment it breaks. They only notice that things stop working the way they used to. The snitch wasn't being shut out, they were being bypassed. Leadership responded politely, briefly, with references to documents instead of discussions, with thanks instead of follow-ups. That's when panic crept in. It wasn't visible at first. Panic in professional spaces rarely looks dramatic. It looks like over-helping, over-explaining, over-communicating. Every message is trying to prove relevance. Every interaction carries an unspoken question. Do you still need me? They tried to reassert narrative control. They flagged risks again, but now the risks were outdated, already addressed, already mitigated. Leadership began asking for sources, for specifics, for evidence. The snitch didn't have them, not because they hadn't been paying attention, but because their role had never required precision. It had required presence, and presence no longer carried weight. I watched this phase with a kind of detached empathy, not pity, understanding. This is what happens when someone builds power on interpretation instead of contribution. When the system no longer tolerates noise, the noise has nowhere to go. They approached me directly one afternoon. It wasn't a confrontation, it was an attempt at recalibration. They asked if I felt things had been off lately, if I thought communication had changed, if I had any insight into why leadership seemed more distant. I answered honestly, carefully. I think expectations are clearer now, I said. There's less need for interpretation. I didn't accuse, I didn't explain further, I didn't offer reassurance. They nodded slowly, smiled, thanked me for my perspective. That was the moment it became too late, because once someone asks why instead of how, they've already lost their position. They're reacting, not shaping. In the weeks that followed, the snitch's role quietly diminished. Not formally, functionally. They were assigned fewer touch points, less visibility, more execution work. The very role they had once leveraged others into. No one framed it as punishment, it was framed as efficiency. That's the cruelty and fairness of systems. They don't need villains, they just need misalignment. I didn't feel victorious, I felt resolved. Nothing I had done could be undone now. Not because I'd trapped anyone, but because the structure no longer supported the behavior. The snitch could adapt, yes, but not without becoming something else entirely. And becoming something else requires self-awareness they hadn't cultivated yet. By the time they realized their old methods were obsolete, the environment had already moved on. Too late to fix it, Too late to reframe it. Too late to make it about me. And that was exactly how it needed to be. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no accusation in the calendar invite, no tension in the subject line. Just a short note from leadership asking for a brief alignment meeting, me, the snitch, and the boss. 30 minutes, clear agenda. By the time it happened, I was calm, not braced, not defensive. Calm in the way you are when nothing needs to be proven anymore. We sat in a small conference room, glass walls, neutral light. The boss opened with a question about process, how information had been flowing lately, what had improved, what still felt inefficient. The snitch spoke first. They explained their usual role, how they liked to connect dots. They wanted to make sure leadership was always informed. The words were careful, polished, and practiced. But something was missing. Specifics. The boss listened, then turned to me. I didn't counter their story. I didn't reference them at all. I spoke about systems. I explained how documentation had reduced ambiguity, how clear ownership has improved turnaround time, how written context allowed teams to operate without constant verbal clarification. I referenced examples, not emotionally, not defensively, just as illustrations of what worked. Dates, documents, outcomes. The boss nodded. Then came the question that changed the temperature of the room. Not sharply, not aggressively, but decisively. Do we still need an intermediary for this process? Silence followed, not an awkward one, a revealing one. The snitch shifted slightly, offered a response about flexibility, about human judgment, about reading between the lines. The boss thanked them, then said something simple. I think the lines are clear enough now. That was it. No reprimand, no exposure, no winner declared. The meeting ended shortly after. We stood, polite goodbyes, neutral expressions. As we walked out, the snitch looked at me, not with anger, not with resentment, but with something closer to recognition, as if they finally understood the terrain they'd been standing on all along. I met their gaze, nodded once, nothing more. Confrontation without heat isn't about dominance. It's about removal. Removing emotion, removing accusation, removing the need for defense. By the time the conversation happened, the outcome had already been decided by the structure itself. Words were just formalities. Later, alone at my desk, I reflected on something that surprised me. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt alignment. Everything that had happened matched my values. No lies, no escalation, no harm, just clarity allowed to do its work. The snitch hadn't been exposed. They hadn't been humiliated. They'd simply been placed in a system where their true function was visible and unnecessary. That kind of confrontation leaves no scars, only lessons. And it was over. After everything settled, I expected to feel different. Stronger maybe, sharper, vindicated. Instead, I felt quieter than ever, but not smaller. What changed wasn't my role on paper. It was my relationship with myself inside it. I no longer measured my presence by how often I spoke or how quickly I responded. I measured it by alignment, by whether my actions matched my values without requiring explanation. People began treating me differently, though few could have said why. They came to me earlier in processes, not later. They asked for my input without prefacing it. They trusted my conclusions without needing translation. Not because I demanded that shift, but because the system now pointed to me naturally. I didn't correct anyone's past assumptions. I didn't rewrite history. I let it fade. The most important change, though, was internal. I no longer feared being underestimated. Underestimation had once felt like erasure. Now it felt like information. A signal that someone didn't yet see the full picture, and that I didn't need them to. I also stopped confusing calm with compliance. Silence, I learned, isn't the absence of power. It's the presence of choice. And when you choose it deliberately, it becomes a form of authorship. I didn't become harder. I didn't become colder. I became more exact. That exactness protected me better than defensiveness ever had. It allowed me to participate without overexposing, to contribute without overexplaining, to trust that clarity, once established, sustains itself. I think about the snitch sometimes, not with bitterness, but with distance. They weren't evil. They were insecure. They found safety in proximity to authority because they didn't know how to build authority themselves. And when that strategy stopped working, they were forced to confront a question they'd long avoided. What do I actually contribute? That's not my lesson to teach. Mine was simpler and harder. I learned that quiet people don't need to become loud to be powerful. They need to become intentional. That justice doesn't always look like exposure. Sometimes it looks like removing the conditions that allowed distortion to thrive. I'm still Ophelia, Still calm, still observant, still capable of being overlooked by people who rely on noise to navigate the world. The difference is that now, I know exactly who I am when no one is watching. And that's enough. There's a particular kind of justice that never announces itself. It doesn't come with applause or visible winners. It doesn't require someone to be shamed or exposed. In fact, from the outside, it can look like nothing happened at all. But something did happen. A system learned to value clarity over commentary. A pattern lost its oxygen. A quiet person reclaimed authorship without raising her voice. That's the kind of justice I believe in now. For a long time, I thought fairness meant being seen, being acknowledged publicly, having someone say out loud, "You were right." But that version of justice still depends on someone else's recognition. It still asks for permission. What I experienced was different. I didn't win by proving anyone wrong. I won by refusing to participate in distortion, by letting truth exist long enough, clean enough, that it no longer needed defending. The office snitch got a taste of their own medicine, not through retaliation, but through removal. Removal of ambiguity, removal of access, removal of the informal channels they depended on. The very behaviors they had used to watch and report on others stopped working once the system stopped rewarding them. No one had to trap them in a lie. They trapped themselves in a pattern that only functioned in the dark. If there's a moral here, it isn't be patient or stay quiet and things will work out. Silence without intention can be a slow erasure. What matters is chosen silence, paired with structure, clarity, and restraint. Justice doesn't always need confrontation. Sometimes it needs design. I share this story because many of us have worked alongside someone who thrives on watching rather than contributing. Someone who gathers fragments of other people's work and repackages them as insight. And often the instinct is to expose them, to call them out, to fight for the narrative. Sometimes the more effective response is to change the narrative's delivery system, to make the truth so accessible, so well placed, that distortion becomes obvious without accusation. That kind of power isn't loud. It doesn't rush. It doesn't seek validation. It waits, and then it moves once. If you've ever been underestimated, talked over, or quietly monitored by someone who mistook your calm for weakness, I'm curious. When did you realize that staying silent was no longer enough? And what did you choose to do instead? I'll be reading the comments.